Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out. We're very, very pleased this evening to have with us a person that I met when we were both young men. And that was an interesting time in Boston. The late 60s, early 70s, there was an awful lot that was happening. And we had people that wore many, many, many hats. This is basically what you had to do. The eyes of the nation and the world focused on Boston for something other than the Kennedys, the Lodges, the Red Sox, the Celtics, and the Bruins. Okay? A lot of people were looking at us for a lot of different things. And to say that the civil rights movement did not have any history here in Boston would be an understatement, because it most certainly did. And there were people who worked quietly in front of the cameras, behind the scenes, day and night with no thank you, because their jobs required the utmost skills of diplomacy and discretion. And apparently some people in very high places took notice of people who had the ability to be both discreet and also to be healers, strategic planners, and with a history of accomplishment. So that goes by way of saying partially how Charles Stith became an overnight success after 30 years. Okay, I mean, that's the way these kind of things happen. As a reporter, I had the opportunity to cover a lot of people who were involved as so-called community leaders who were self-anointed, and those people who were actually leaders in Boston, not just for the community, because Boston has many communities. And the Reverend Charles Stith was one of the young ministers that was in town that developed credibility very quickly, was accepted on all ranges, or all sides of the town and the issue, because of his ability to stay focused on what is the primary mission and is it fair and balanced. So I got a chance to cover this gentleman in a lot of different perspectives. And over the years, I was very pleased to watch his growth, his recognition as a national figure, his recognition in the world of academia. And finally, as you would probably have read the program, who was it that became our president that in a time of great trouble and great difficulty decided to reach down and pick someone that we know as our guest speaker tonight to become the U.S. ambassador to Tanzania. Now, as you know from looking at your programs, these were not easy times. Some of the developments that claimed lives were most unfortunate, and it's easy when you look at the movies to see the ambassador, he's at the party, you know, and he's having a luncheon, and he's just, you know, out on a boat, and, you know, like in a receiving line, and it's just one big happy job. Right? Wrong. Real life sets in. Lots of things happen. Your phone rings late at night. Discretion, leadership, confidentiality, and diplomatic skills are definitely in play, especially when you get a tough assignment like our guest speaker had tonight in times of great difficulty and loss of life in a part of the country where there was great upheaval. The phone call from President Clinton came and went to our guest speaker, Dr. Charles Stith. Charles, welcome. You know, I alluded to just a little bit that an ambassador's life is just one big party after another, and you got the limos, and, you know, what's it really like being an ambassador?
Well, there are a lot of limos, a lot of parties. You know, some assignments are more challenging than others. And as you alluded to, Tanzania happened to be one of those particularly challenging assignments. I was finally confirmed after a vetting process that ran almost 9 months, and confirmed by the Senate 1 month before Al-Qaeda blew up our embassy in Dar es Salaam. Mm-hmm. And then I assumed my post 1 month after that. So it gave literal meaning to getting started with a bang.
Okay.
So we had a pretty challenging exercise.
You know, people think that the life of an ambassador does not require a lot, well, may think that it does not require a lot of negotiations, with meeting with people who are locals, where you have a lot of institutionalized ways of life to overcome, you not being from there, and the assumption for some people is that all ambassadors are wealthy and they are appointed because they've given a lot of money to the power of the party that's in charge. What'd that cost you?
In reality, is you do wind up spending a considerable amount of your own money. But in my case, not much of it was for entertainment. Tanzania is one of those unique countries. Historically, the role that it's played in terms of the liberation of the continent, and the role that it plays contemporarily in terms of helping to move the politics of the continent forward. So it's looked to by a number of regions. It's in East Africa, so it's a part of the East African region, which encompasses Kenya, which was also, as you probably recall, in '98, the other country that was bombed during the same period. Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. And Tanzania, it literally straddles the equator. So in addition to East Africa, it's also a part of the Southern African community, which comprises 14 countries. And I had a meeting scheduled in that vein. It took me outside of Tanzania to travel both south and east. And the expense that you wind up incurring, at least in my case, was to make sure that my family got a chance to see some of these very interesting and exciting places as well. The State Department doesn't cover that dime.
I hear you.
Yeah. But it was an investment in terms of broadening my kids in particular, their perspective. It was well worth it.
You know, you're being a little modest because you didn't get there because you were a person who just went on trips and junkets. I mean, you paid a lot of dues in the trenches here in Massachusetts, and also as the founder of ONE, which is a national organization. So a lot of people know you for your work there. How much does that prepare you for the requirements of being an ambassador?
Well, interestingly, when President Clinton initially approached me about doing Tanzania, it reflected a couple of things. The first of which is that, as you recall, in addition to the things that I was doing locally in Boston and nationally around community reinvestment, we were also very much in the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement. And when South Africa approached its new dispensation in 1994, as you recall, Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. 4 years later, they had the first fully democratic, multiracial elections in the history of South Africa. And I was a part of President Clinton's official delegation to go monitor those elections. So there was an appreciation of my interest in Africa. When I asked him again, why Tanzania, his retort was really interesting. He said that you understand undercapitalized communities.
Having lived and worked in Boston, yes, you did,
You
right?
understand undercapitalized communities. So there are probably some parallels between that and undercapitalized countries. And if you recall, one of the very significant things that took place in the Clinton administration on the foreign front is his interest in shifting our focus in Africa to encompass more than aid and humanitarian issues, but to take in issues of trade and investment. And so he wanted to have a number of folks on the continent who could help give some traction to that agenda. So Jim Joseph, who was a former CEO of Cummins Engine and then transitioned out of that to head up the Foundation for Combined Philanthropy, was in South Africa. Tom McDonald, an investment banker and lawyer, was in Zimbabwe. Me in Tanzania. So a number of appointments like that in order to try to give some traction to this agenda, to look at Africa as an investment venue over as against simply a cause for humanitarian concern.
I'm going to move away now and let you get into this, and our capable computer operator, oh God help us, is sitting there. Ambassador Charles Stith.
Thank you. Well, you know, I can't resist using this line. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Bucket List.
Yep.
But this kind of tete-a-tete between Jack and Morgan, and he says, "My main man, Ray." Well, tonight I've got my main man, Ray, who's going to come back up here in a second and help me with my PowerPoint presentation. I noted in well, first of all, let me say that I appreciate the introduction by Maurice for a lot of reasons. One, everybody just likes to have people say very good things about them, so that's always a plus. But as he mentioned, we go back many, many years. And one of the real blessings I think that one can have in life is to develop a set of relationships over time where those relationships are not only sustaining and supportive in ways, but are in some ways character shaping and character affirming. So when you've got somebody who knew you when, who can, with a straight face and integrity, say something pretty good about you, it's pretty special. And I'd say that in no small way, my eagerness to be with you all this evening is a testament to the respect and admiration and affection that I have for Maurice, because in the same way Ray said he's delivered for you all in the past, there have been many a day where he delivered in the city of Boston, and it's a better place because of it. So give him a round of applause if you will. The advertisement in the program is that I am going to talk about politics and religion, a liberal's perspective of whether the two should mix. And that was predicated upon the fact that my first book was titled Political Religion. And I have always maintained a foot in both spheres, both politics and religion, and even still. But what they discovered, which I could have told them if they had asked, the doggone book's been out of print for a while, so it really is hard to pick up. I use a chapter actually in my course on policy formulation and action. And at this point, we just Xerox the chapter, and I give it to the students. But I did think, after some consideration here, that there is a way to get into this subject of politics and religion, but to do it in a way more reflective of what I'm doing now. And what I'm doing now is Africa. And the implications of politics and religion in Africa, particularly the impact of radical Islam in Africa, is certainly something that we can explore and find I think some interest and at least a point for conversation. The way that I'd like to get into this, and my talk is probably going to be less than 45 minutes for a whole lot of reasons, but the most important of which is that I think it's probably be more meaningful if we can talk about what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
And so the more quickly we can get into a Q&A, I think probably the better. But the general topic that I like to talk about these days is the Africa you don't know. And there are a number of reasons why. Probably to start with, the most significant from a geopolitical perspective, Africa is very important right now to the geopolitical strategic interests of the United States. A lot of people don't appreciate it. Right now, the big item in today's news is the leaking pipe in the Gulf, oil. And the conversation, I was reading Friedman in the New York Times the other day, and he said that this could potentially be Obama's 9/11 moment, And by that, he said that it represents an opportunity to really put a big picture agenda on the table around energy security. And I don't want to argue that one way or the other, but one of the points that I would make when you think about oil is that it's obviously not just about the gas pump. The global economy is a petroleum-based economy. Probably 99% of the products in this room are a petroleum derivative. The point being, as much as we'd like, we're not going to get away from oil anytime soon. The Middle East continues to be one of the most volatile parts of the world, and unfortunately, I don't see that being resolved neatly or quickly anytime soon, which means that there are other parts of the world to which we'll need to turn in order to achieve energy security. One of the key places in the world is the continent of Africa. Presently, 17% of our petroleum comes from Nigeria. Angola, which is also West Africa, Southwest Africa, that number is up in the high teens. And we project that by 2020, somewhere north of 25% of the oil that we import in this country will come from the continent of Africa. Now, when you start to add to that things like uranium, if you recall in his State of the Union address, President Obama indicated that nuclear energy was going to have to be a part of our strategy of greening our economy. There is a good part of our uranium supply that likewise comes from Africa. So we have some real strategic political interest on the economic side in Africa. This issue of terrorism, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail as I get toward the end of my presentation. But suffice to say for the moment, the bombing in Tanzania, the bombing in Kenya, some of the things that we see playing out in the Delta region in Nigeria, all would suggest that in terms of the fight against terrorism, that there are some geopolitical interests that we have to protect on the continent. The other reason that I like to talk about the Africa that we don't know is because a lot of folks don't know it. I'm presently on the faculty at Boston University, and I head a center, the African Presidential Archives and Research Center, and our mission is to track current trends and developments on the continent. Translated, is to show the modern Africa. When we got ready to develop our brochure, we went to some of the traditional photo services, UP, AP, Reuters, National Geographic, looking for pictures that could show modern Africa. And what I discovered was this, that if you wanted pictures of starving babies with bloated bellies and flies swarming around their heads, you could get those by the dozens. If you wanted pictures of animals, giraffe, elephants, lions, I mean, you could get them up the kazoo. You know, you could get elephants doing this, you know, lions doing that. Yeah, but you couldn't get pictures of modern Africa. And so one of the reasons that I like to talk about the Africa we don't know is because we don't know it. And it's important that we know it. From the perspective of the geopolitical interests that I talked about, if we're going to make intelligent decisions, we have to know, and we're going to seek friendships, we have to know the friends we seek. And from a human perspective, in sub-Saharan Africa, there are well over 850 million people. That's a good chunk of the folks on this planet. And they ought not be marginalized. And we ought know more about who they are and why they are what they are, and their hopes and their dreams, their aspirations, their loves, the things that inspire them. So this is one of the reasons, the reasons I like to do that. So the first thing we're going to do, Ray, give me the next slide up. The first thing that we're going to do before we get into the Africa is we're going to learn to speak a little Kiswahili. Kiswahili is a Bantu language spoken primarily in East and Southern Africa. It is the lingua franca for about 130 million people. Didn't know that, did you? No. Okay. Now, we're going to learn a little Kiswahili this evening. Okay? The first phrase is pronounced habari.
Habari.
Yako.
Yako.
Habari Yako. And you see there's a question mark there. So we're asking a question. Look at my class. That's exactly it. How are you? Okay. The response, Nzuri.
Nzuri.
Sana. Very well. How are you? Very well. And then the second response after I'm fine, very well, is to ask the person the reciprocal question. That is. And instead of saying habari yako, you can then respond by saying nawe. And you. Okay? So we're going to do this, okay? Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay, we're going to do this. Habari yako. Nawe. There you go. All right, give yourselves a hand. So you've learned some Kiswahili this evening. Ray, let's add the next slide. What I want to run through rather quickly, again, is the Africa that most folks never see. This is the Oliver Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is what their airport looks like. It really kind of puts Logan to shame. Ray, let's have the next slide. This is the Kilimanjaro Hotel, the Kapinski, run by the Kapinski Group, which is a German outfit. And it's in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. As a matter of fact, right up here is my room when I'm in Dar es Salaam. But the Kapinski, as the facade would suggest, and here you can see the interior of the lounge up on the 8th floor. It's modern in every sense of what you would expect if you were in London or Paris or Boston or New York. Every room is equipped with a flat screen TV. You can go Wi-Fi on the internet. They've got a great spa with Thai personnel, and it's a great experience. Next slide, Ray. And of course, in addition to the modernity of Africa, you've also got these tremendous natural assets. Mount Kilimanjaro, again in Tanzania, called the rooftop of the continent, is one of the most beautiful spots on the planet. Next slide, Ray. Here is Mauritius, and this is a picture of the Four Seasons. And I decided to do these kind of pictures because I know the kind of places that Maurice likes to hang out at.
That's good.
But Mauritius is a very interesting place. If you look on your map, and I'm always amazed when I do this, it's far off the east coast of Africa. You'll see, first of all, off the east coast, southern east coast, a larger island, which is Madagascar. East of Madagascar is Mauritius. And the island is so tiny that on most maps, there's no way to really represent it. So all you see is a word in the middle of the ocean, Mauritius. But Mauritius is a very interesting case. At independence, it was dirt poor. Its primary export was sugar. And when they achieved independence, very few people held out prospects of hope or prosperity for this teeny tiny rock of an island. The leadership of that island, though, was very enlightened, and they appreciated that what they lacked in natural resources, they had in human resources. And they made a fundamental decision to invest in their people. During the era that we call the period of structural adjustments, where the IMF and the World Bank back in the 80s was really pushing poor countries, particularly those in Africa, to cut back on education, to cut back on health care, and those sorts of things as a way of balancing their budgets and paying off these huge amounts of debt, in many cases run up by dictators that we had put in place. The leadership of Mauritius refused to make those cuts. They stood up to the IMF and World Bank and declared to them, and actually in the book that I've got, Carl Offman, the former president of Mauritius, recounts his many meetings with the World Bank and IMF, where they protested and indicated that they were not going to cut back on education. As a result, what we now talk about when we talk about Mauritius is the Mauritian miracle. The first thing that they decided to do is high-end tourism. And so you've got 10 of the greatest resorts on this teeny tiny island that you'll find anywhere on the planet. They then made the decision to segue from that to the manufacture of textiles. And even today, many of the product that you wear, and you might have something on now that was manufactured in Mauritius. Ralph Lauren, I know the polo, a lot of his stuff was manufactured in Mauritius. And then most recently, they segued into financial services, all again because they made the decision to invest in their people. That's the part of the Africa we don't know, right? And this is, again, we're back in South Africa, and what you've got here are artist representations, because we got these early on, of the new stadia that have been built to host the World Cup, which starts in a couple of weeks. And all of these venues are as magnificent as they appear here, and there's every expectation that the World Cup in South Africa is going to be as nice and as magnificent as any hosted anywhere. Next slide. You got to get back to this because this is also a part, it's not all bricks and mortar, but it's natural beauty. It's an opportunity to get a glimpse at Eden, or what it might have been like, if you will. Next slide. Now, this is one of the very interesting things. The maps that we generally look at on a day-to-day basis, probably most of the maps in this library are not accurate. It's much more of a political map. The more accurate map are the Peters maps, which give you a great sense of how large the continent really is. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But within the continent of Africa, you can put all of Europe, Alaska, the continental United States, all of China, and still have room to spare. Now, the first time I had an opportunity to appreciate how large the continent really was, we had a chief of missions conference in Stuttgart, Germany. Wesley Clark was still head of NATO at the time. and we were being briefed on security and defense issues. And one of my fellow ambassadors, when we got to the Q&A, noted that on the map behind the general, you had Africa at its center, and it was uncharacteristically large as compared with the rest of the world. That is, as we're used to seeing it. So he asked the question, General, I've noticed that you've got this map behind you, and you've got certain strategic elements on the map, but you also have Africa much larger. Is that because this is a conference on Africa? And Wesley Clark said, sir, no. This is a precise representation of the continent relative to the rest of the world. And the ambassador then said, General, are you sure? And I love this response. He said, sir, I'm in the business of blowing things up, and you have to be sure about issues like that. It's the second largest continent. There are 53 people. Africa has the largest number of landlocked countries of any other continent in the world. Can anybody tell me why that's the case? I'll tell you. It's because of an event which you probably read about a few years ago when you were in high school, the Berlin Conference of 1884, where the European powers got together and cut the continent up like a country ham into spheres of influence. And from their perspective, it made no difference in terms of natural boundaries. It made no difference in terms of ethnic groups. It was all about who was going to get what. And as a result of this, you've got all of these crazy configurations of countries that the continent, quite frankly, is still yoked with, and in many ways is a subtext to a lot of the problems that still exist, right? And as you see there, I anticipated the slide in the comments that I just made, and it gives you some just more detail. I note that last year we did a roundtable in Berlin on the Berlin Conference and the issue of land reform. And we discovered that last year was the 125th anniversary of the Berlin Conference. So we thought it would be a good idea to go back 125 years later and try to get right what they got wrong 125 years before. Next slide, please. Fun facts, the Nile River is the longest river in Africa and also the longest river in the world, running from Uganda all the way to Egypt. Africa is the largest desert, the Sahara. Nigeria is the continent's most populated country with 125 to 145 million people. Over 2,000 dialects. I've got to change this. They're not really languages, but dialects. The total population is over 1 billion people. That's 3 times as many folks as in the United States, but still less than in China and India. Next slide, Ray. Again, it gives you a little more variety of the people, over 800 ethnic groups. 40% of Africans practice a wide variety of traditional religions. We all know by now that it's the home of the human species. And I love the little tagline at the bottom. Africa has modern cities, and its people love soccer, and the women love to shop. And they know Michael Jackson. This is a little bit about what we do. We focus on 16 countries on the continent. And we focus on those 16 countries because they're serious about democracy. They're serious about free market reform. And our contention is that in the same way the original 13 colonies of the United States served as the anchors for the colossus which we've become, that these 16 countries on the continent of Africa have the same potential. Benin is one of the countries we track. Ray, hit the next slide. Botswana is another country that we track. Cape Verde. There are a lot of Cape Verdeans in this area. Another fact that most folks don't know, there are more Cape Verdeans in the New England area than there are in Cape Verde. The next slide, Ghana is another one of the countries we track. As you know, the president just visited Ghana back in July. In sub-Saharan Africa, it was the first country to achieve independence in 1957. A great little Ghana story. We were becoming really into this independence thing for Africa during that era. Eisenhower, subsequently Kennedy, the Peace Corps, etc. And so committed were we to this freedom movement taking place across the continent that President Eisenhower sent President Nixon to the lowering of the Union Jack in Ghana and the raising of the Black Star. And the story goes that at the reception, Vice President Nixon sauntered up to this gentleman and he said, "This is a great day for Africa. It's a great day for Ghana. How does it feel to be free?" 1957, right? Guy says, "I'm from Alabama, and I wouldn't know." Next slide. Kenya is another one of our countries. Next slide. Liberia, which now has the distinction of having the first and only popularly elected female head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Malawi, this actually is a good buddy of mine. I was just in Malawi a couple of weeks ago for his wedding. He was a widower for several years and married a woman who was formerly in his cabinet. And when I was there in February, he invited me back for the wedding. I said, "Mr. President, I've been gone so long that, I should probably bring my wife with me." He said, "That would be a good idea." This is the line, and I loved it. He said, "Because that sort of thing is good for internal peace and security." And fellas who are married, particularly all those who have been married a while, know that internal peace and security is a very important thing. Next slide. Mali is another one of our countries. Next slide. Mauritius, which we talked about a little bit. Mozambique is another one of our countries. Namibia. Next slide. Nigeria. Yar'Adua, as you know, just died. Goodluck Jonathan is now the president of Nigeria. Next slide. Senegal. Next slide. South Africa, Jake Zuma. Next slide. Next slide. Tanzania. That's me with the president. Next slide. Zambia. Next slide. Next slide. It should be another 4 slides. Is it? Or is that it?
Looks like it's it.
Okay. Well, the 4 that are missing get me into this thing about religion. That's a shame. But several points that I wanted to highlight about Islam in Africa. One, which I've alluded earlier, and that is it is a prominent force on the continent. Islam has over 1,000-year history in West Africa and even longer in East Africa. There are approximately 300 million Muslims in Africa, significantly more than all of the Middle East. After the bombing in Tanzania, given the extent to which that preoccupied our time and attention, I obviously developed another kind of interest in this whole issue of radical Islam and its potential impact on the continent. And as I began to read, what I discovered is that before the jihad against America, that there were 4 other jihads, 2 of which were in Africa. The second jihad, which was in the Senegambia region in the 17th century. The 4th jihad, which was in Sudan. because Africa is home to so many Muslims, there are some synergies, if you will, that allow radical elements to root easier and more deeply. The large constituencies, which I referenced a minute ago, and the 300 million African Muslims. Secondly, with the exception of Mauritius, the promise of capitalism has not been fulfilled yet across the continent. There are some very dramatic, some very dynamic, some very important changes taking place in that regard, but the loop has not yet been closed, and the reality is, given the extent of the gap, in places like South Africa, where apartheid had a 350-year history, you can't close that kind of gap in a generation or two. And so this issue of poverty is going to continue to provide fertile ground. One of the other elements is that some of those groups that we call Islamic terrorists, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, countries like Libya and Iran, we forget that those were some of the staunchest allies of liberation movements in Africa in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. People forget it. We saw Mandela's picture, the happy warrior. But the reality is, it was 2 years after he was elected president of South Africa before we removed his name officially from the terror watch list. And so the relationships over time are pretty profound. While I argue, and I'm going to stop on this point, that Africa is clearly more than the sum of its problems. I think its brightest days are ahead of it. I think they're making substantial progress, both in terms of governance and in terms of economic performance. One of the issues, the dirty little secret that doesn't get talked about as much as it should, is this issue of radical Islam and the extent to which it needs to be addressed. And I think in order to address it, it starts with African leaders openly addressing and defining the problem. It means African governments responding to grassroots issues like poverty and looking at ways to work with disparate elements in their countries. And finally, the intracontinental cooperation and intercontinental cooperation in terms of dealing with some of these seemingly intractable problems. I'll stop on that note, and then let's open the floor for questions or comments.
How about it?
Mr. Ambassador, what is the current status on the great mother continent of Africa of the HIV/AIDS epidemic?
It is still a significant problem.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was the state of HIV/AIDS on the continent. It's still a significant problem, and I'm glad you asked that question because it enables me to come back to a point that I mentioned earlier. And I focused it specific to Mauritius, and I talked about education and how they responded to it. But it is one of the great and cruel ironies of the last 2 decades that in the 80s, as we were becoming aware of this thing called HIV/AIDS, in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan said that it was clearly a curse from God on people who had deviant lifestyles. You all remember that?
Yep.
It was right at that same period that the IMF and World Bank were forcing countries in Africa to cut back in terms of health care. And so it stymied the growth of a sector that, had it been developing over a 20-year period, they would have been much better positioned to deal with the pandemic. And that's a bit of history that I think is important as we kind of think our way through a problem like that. Now, fast forward, some of the greatest strides that we've been able to make in dealing with HIV/AIDS on the continent of Africa are a result of policies implemented by President George Bush.
Yes.
I'm a Democrat and I'm a Southerner, and so we've got this. There's not many of us anymore, but we yellow dog Democrats. We vote for a yellow dog if he was a Democrat. That's how the genesis of the point. But not really, of course. But it used to drive my Democratic friends absolutely bonkers when I'd say, the most progressive president we've had in the history of the United States relative to Africa was George W. Bush. You might recall that during the first term, he put the president's emergency plan on the table, the president's emergency plan to deal with AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, all of which are critical problems, $15 billion. And it was so successful that when he went back to Congress 5 years later to ask for a $30 billion appropriation, Congress saw 15 and raised him another 13. So we wound up with $43 billion in the pot. And it's enabled the continent to get a handle on the problem in a way that they would not have been able to do otherwise. And the growth of the problem has slowed as a percentage of the population, but it's still an issue.
And would you speak just for a quick moment in terms of what that has done to create orphans? Because you have mothers, fathers, and in some cases 3/4 of a family being wiped out. And then we'll take another question from this gentleman back here.
There is, an orphan problem. Exactly how large it is, Maurice, I couldn't tell you in terms of chapter and verse. But as important as it is dealing with the back end of these kind of problems, like dealing with the orphans and the retrovirals in order to treat people who've contracted the disease, the more challenging issue from the perspective of the West, in my opinion, is to be able to help these countries develop capacity. One of the issues that I've kind of floated with some of my friends at the State Department, including the Secretary, is to think about, and it might be a hard sell in the current economic environment, but to think about developing an approach to aid to change it fundamentally as we know it. That phrase sound familiar? Mm. But to do it in a way that we get out of the aid business in 10 years. Not because we become insensitive to the plight of human beings, and there will always be emergency situations where we'll have to be responsive. But my point in arguing this proposition is that what we ought to be thinking about are ways to help these countries develop capacity so that they can develop their own strategies for dealing with this kind of stuff. Americans are exceedingly generous people. We are. We are very generous people. But our attention span is as short as we are generous. If we don't get it done in a few years, it's come on, okay, let's go to the next thing. Well, a lot of these problems like this they're long-term problems. And ultimately, if these countries are going to deal with these challenges, they've got to have the capacity on their own to deal with it.
Okay, this gentleman.
Mr. Ambassador, first of all, thank you. You've really been enlightening, and I'd like for you to give us some perspective or dimension to the element of corruption. You've highlighted some countries that really are bootstrapping themselves, doing the right thing day in, day out, and yet in the press we're constantly bombarded by this negative perspective that everyone is corrupt, when in fact, to my understanding, it's actually a very small part, although it seems to be distorted. Can you give us a better perspective?
I mean, I think, let me pick up where you ended the question, which is the statement that I wanted to probably start with in answering it. And that is, it is a problem. And I could get theological here,
Well, then go ahead.
It's not simply an economic problem. It's also a problem that you've got to understand theologically. you know, can you say Wall Street crisis? You know, corruption, you know, there's some aspect of the human personality that some folks will do wrong even when they've got an opportunity to do right. It's unavoidable. It's why we need regulation. It's why regulations need to be enforced, etc. Having said that relative to Africa, if you read this stuff with a fine eye, what you will discover is that you're basically reading over and over stories about the same dysfunctional places. You know, you're going to read about Congo 2 or 3 times every year. Now, because it's cast as Africa, you know, people don't disaggregate, it's Africa. You know, you're going to read about Sudan. You know, I mean, that's the cycle. The interesting thing about the 16 countries we track, you heard me mention initially that there are about 850 million people in sub-Saharan Africa in 53 countries. Well, actually 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. In the 16 countries we track, there are 650 million people. Now, what that means is this. What that means is this, is that the vast majority of Africans wake up every morning in a country where there's some sort of transparent political process where they get to participate and decide who leads the country, and where leadership is being held accountable for delivering the goods. In democracies, wherever they are, there's one fundamental principle that comes into play on election day. And the great 20th century philosopher Janet Jackson said it best. It's what have you done for me lately? On election day, that's the question that people ask. And in those 16 countries, you've got 650 million people, almost more than 2/3, that have that option and opportunity. And all of those guys that run these countries are struggling with how to deliver. And they got it, that you can't bring prosperity, you can't create opportunities and options for people at the bottom if you got people at the top stealing.
I think we have time for one more very quick question, then a quick book signings. For a final question.
I'm having trouble understanding that the people there blame everybody else but their own government. You would think that they would finally understand this, that their own government is at fault in a lot of their problems. And to be as fanatic as they are, killing, I mean, we all are born with an instinct of survival. I think they must be missing a gene or two because they don't have it.
So the question is,
Well, you know, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's a typical question. And I would respond to it this way. And it kind of starts with a point about the landlocked countries. That over the last 500 years, a good deal of Africa's destiny has been determined by factors beyond its control or beyond their power. And it starts with how these countries were configured. Another very interesting phenomenon is that while the continent started to achieve independence in 1957, the last country to become independent in the sense that we think of independent nations was South Africa in 1994. So you had one set of countries that achieved liberation in the 1960s. The Lusophone countries, those that were former Portuguese colonies, achieved independence in the 1970s. You had Zimbabwe that achieved independence in 1980. And you had South Africa, which finally achieved independence in 1994. Now just think for a minute of how different the United States would have been in terms of its development if the first set of countries that achieved independence were Georgia, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And then 10 years later, Virginia, Maryland, and then the last state to achieve independence was New York. When you think about the extent to which New York has been an engine to help grow this very dynamic economy that we've inherited, once you put it in that perspective and you start to think about it relative to Africa, it helps explain to some extent the kind of stunted growth that you've seen across the continent. Now, when you add to that the fact that during this nascent stage, we called it the Cold War, which it was for us, but on the continent of Africa, it was a very hot war. And we spent billions of dollars destabilizing governments in the name of securing hegemony over against the former Soviet Union, and they did the same. Then you add to that this issue of structural adjustments, which I talked about earlier. And then you finally add to that this issue of apartheid, which we tended to think of as a South African phenomenon. But one of the very interesting things about the continent since '94 is that a lot of the exponential growth that we've seen take place is being driven because of capital and talent out of South Africa. Now just imagine the difference that could have made if South Africa had achieved independence in '84.
We sure would like to continue, but as like with most things, our time has come. How about a wonderful round of applause for a great